On the 15th of January, 1925, in the small rural town of Crowborough in East Sussex, England, a chicken farmer named Norman Thorne made a phone call to the local police.
His voice was calm, measured. He said he had something to report.
They found Elsie Cameron in a ravine behind his property, dead for days, her body decomposing in the winter cold.
She was 21 years old.
And Thorne's explanation for what happened to her would challenge everything the police thought they understood about how to solve a murder. Here's the impossible question at the heart of this case. How do you prove when someone died when the body is in an advanced state of decomposition? How do you determine guilt when the physical evidence is ambiguous? And how do you ensure that forensic science, still in its infancy, doesn't convict an innocent person, or let a guilty one walk free? Because this case, solved in 1924 and tried in 1925, became a turning point in criminal investigation. It was the moment that insects, flies, maggots, beetles, became witnesses in a murder trial. It was the moment that a young scientist named Bernard Spilsbury and an entomologist named Alexander Bohart challenged not just the police, but the very foundations of how justice determines time of death. But to understand how it got here, to understand why this case still echoes through forensic textbooks a century later, we have to go back. We have to understand Elsie Cameron, we have to understand Norman Thorne, and we have to understand the quiet, unsettling world of rural Sussex in the early 1920s. If you're interested in more global true crime told this way, cases that expose the evolution of justice itself, consider subscribing to Enter the Crime.
Now, let's go back to where it all began.
Crowborough is a small market town in East Sussex, in the southeast of England. Today it's a peaceful suburb, but in the 1920s, it was on the cusp of change, still rural, still tied to the land, but slowly modernizing. The town itself sat on the high weald, an area of rolling hills dotted with farms, woodlands, and a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The early 1920s in England were a particular moment in time.
The Great War had ended just 5 years before.
Millions of men had returned home, changed, traumatized, trying to rebuild lives in a country that had itself transformed. There was economic uncertainty.
There was social upheaval.
The old certainties of Victorian and Edwardian England were crumbling. But in small towns like Crowborough, change came slowly.
People still worked the land. They still knew their neighbors. Gossip traveled fast. Scandal was noticed. And scandal there was.
Elsie Cameron was the daughter of a respectable local family. Her father, William Cameron, was a hard-working man, solid, conventional, the kind of father who expected his children to marry well and live quietly. Elsie was his daughter, and she was, by the standards of the time, a young woman with prospects. But Elsie had dreams that didn't quite fit the mold.
She was intelligent. She was spirited.
She wasn't content to simply wait for a suitable husband to appear. She wanted more from life, more independence, more opportunity. She took a job as a governess, working for a family not far from Crowborough. She had interests, opinions, and a certain modern sensibility that made her stand out in a small town where young women were still expected to be demure and compliant. In the eyes of the town, Elsie was respectable enough. But there was something about her that suggested she might not follow the conventional path. That's where Norman Thorne entered her life. Norman Thorne was a chicken farmer. Not wealthy, not poor, a man working for himself, building something, trying to create an independent life. He was in his early 30s, quiet, introspective, not particularly outgoing, or charming. He was the kind of man who was noticed more for what he wasn't gregarious, wasn't the life of the party, wasn't particularly ambitious. But he and Elsie Cameron became involved. The exact nature of their relationship is one of the first questions that will haunt this case. According to the town gossip, and this matters, because gossip in 1924 was how information moved through small communities, Norman and Elsie were intimate.
They were more than friends. But Norman, it seems, was not willing to commit. He did not want to marry her.
For Elsie, this was agonizing. In 1924 England, a young woman's reputation was everything. If she was known to be intimate with a man outside of marriage, her respectability was in question. Her marriage prospects were damaged. Her family's standing could suffer. This wasn't casual. This was a genuine crisis. For Norman, the situation was complicated. He may have cared for Elsie, but he also had his own life, his own plans. He was not ready to surrender his independence to marriage, particularly not to a woman whose family might consider him beneath them socially or financially. By late 1924, their relationship was fraying.
Elsie wanted marriage or commitment. Norman wanted distance.
What makes this situation psychologically crucial is that Elsie was trapped. She had become pregnant, or believed she was pregnant.
Some sources suggest she had a miscarriage.
What is clear is that she was desperately trying to tie Norman to her through the only leverage she had, the threat that her condition would become public knowledge.
This was not melodrama.
In 1924, an unmarried pregnant woman faced genuine social ruin.
She could lose her job. Her family could lose standing. She could be cast out.
The stakes, by modern standards, seem almost incomprehensible, but they were utterly real to Elsie Cameron. Norman's response, as the historical record suggests, was to withdraw further.
He became evasive. He suggested that perhaps they should not see each other. He avoided her.
From Elsie's perspective, she was being abandoned. She was in genuine crisis, and the man she believed had put her in that position was walking away. From Norman's perspective, he was trapped, caught between genuine human sympathy and his desperate desire to escape the situation.
He was not a bad man necessarily, but he was a weak one.
And weakness, under pressure, can lead to catastrophic decisions. By early January 1925, their relationship had reached a breaking point. Elsie had begun to show up at the chicken farm unannounced.
She was writing letters.
She was emotional, desperate, trying everything she could think of to make Norman acknowledge his responsibility.
Norman's response was to avoid her. He made himself scarce when she visited. He became defensive when she found him.
But Elsie was persistent.
She could not accept that this was ending.
She could not accept that she would be left alone to face the consequences. On January 15, 1925, Elsie Cameron went to the chicken farm for what would be the last time. What happened in the hours that followed remains, even in the historical record, partly contested. But what is undeniable is this: by the time Norman Thorne picked up the telephone to call the police later that day, Elsie Cameron was dead. January 15, 1925, began as an ordinary winter day in Crowborough. The sun, what there was of it, rose late. The temperature hovered just above freezing. It was the kind of day when the English countryside is at its bleakest: no snow, no dramatic weather, just grey, cold, uninviting. Elsie Cameron left her position as governess that morning with a stated intention. She was going to visit a friend in London.
At least, that's what she told her employer. But London was not where she was going. She was going to the chicken farm. She was going to see Norman Thorne. We don't know exactly what time she arrived. We don't know exactly what she said or what she expected. But we do know that Thorne did not want her there.
The farm was isolated, perfect for privacy, but also perfect for something else.
There were no neighbors to see. There was no one to hear.
Elsie and Norman argued.
This much is established.
The nature of the argument, the exact words, the emotional temperature, these are matters that would later be heavily contested. But something happened in those hours that left Elsie dead. According to Norman's later account, and this is crucial to understand, Elsie had taken her own life. She had, he claimed, either taken poison or hanged herself. He said she did this in his presence, or immediately after he'd left the room. He said he found her body and, in panic and confusion, made a series of decisions that would define the rest of his life. He did not immediately call the police. Instead, he hid the body.
4 days. He left it where it was.
And as those days passed, something critically important was happening, something that would, ironically, save him or condemn him depending on how you interpret the evidence. By January 19th, when police finally arrived at the farm, Elsie Cameron's body had been exposed to the elements for 4 days. It was winter, cold but not freezing. And in that time, the processes of decomposition had begun. More importantly, insects had been at work. When the body was examined by Dr. Bernard Spilsbury, one of the most famous pathologists of his era, and later by Alexander Bohart, an entomologist from Berkeley, California, something remarkable happened. They didn't just examine the victim's physical wounds and state. They examined what was feeding on the body.
They found blowfly pupae. They found maggots in various stages of development. And they counted them. They measured them.
They studied them with the intensity of scientists examining the most important evidence they'd ever seen.
Because flies don't operate on a whim. They have life cycles.
Eggs hatch into larvae, what we call maggots. Those larvae grow and develop according to temperature and other environmental factors. By examining how far along the larvae were, Bohart and other entomologists could estimate, with a reasonable degree of accuracy, how long they had been developing. And that meant they could estimate when the eggs had been laid. And that meant they could estimate when the body had been exposed to the elements in a state where flies could access it. Here's where this case becomes genuinely compelling from a forensic standpoint. Norman Thorne claimed that Elsie had died on January 15th. But the entomological evidence suggested something different. If Elsie had truly died on the 15th and been left exposed in that state, the insects would have been further along in their development. The larvae would have been larger, more advanced, further into their life cycle. But they weren't. The insects suggested that Elsie's body had been placed in a position where flies could access it more recently, perhaps just a day or two before the body was discovered. This contradicted Norman's story.
Now, consider what this means.
If Norman's story was true, if Elsie had died on the 15th and he'd simply left her body there, then the insects would have told a consistent story. But they didn't. Instead, they suggested that something else had happened. That Elsie had died on the 15th, but that her body had been hidden or covered in some way for the first few days, and only later exposed to the elements where flies could reach it.
Why would Norman do that?
What would cause him to hide the body initially, then expose it? The simplest explanation, because he couldn't bring himself to call the police immediately.
Because he panicked.
Because he tried to figure out what to do, and only after several days of internal agony did he decide that the only way forward was to admit what had happened. But here's the alternative. What if Norman was lying about what happened? What if Elsie didn't simply die in his presence of natural causes or suicide? What if something darker had occurred? The autopsy, conducted by Spilsbury, who would become famous for his meticulous work, found injuries on Elsie's body that were consistent with strangulation or asphyxiation.
Her face showed signs of congestion.
Her neck showed bruising consistent with pressure having been applied.
So, the story becomes more complicated.
Elsie Cameron did not simply ingest poison or step off a chair.
She had been asphyxiated.
Now, could she have asphyxiated herself? It's theoretically possible, but it would be unusual and would require a particular set of circumstances. The more straightforward interpretation is that Elsie had been manually asphyxiated, that is, someone had applied pressure to her neck or mouth and nose, preventing her from breathing, until she died.
And that someone was almost certainly Norman Thorne.
But here's where the psychology of the moment matters. Did Norman intend to kill her? Or did he, in the heat of argument, in a moment of panic and desperation, apply pressure that he thought would be temporary, to silence her, to stop her, to gain control of the situation, only to realize too late that he'd gone too far? The difference between murder and manslaughter in English law is the difference between intentional killing and killing in a moment of passion or recklessness. And those distinctions would become absolutely central to what happened next. Because as the body lay in the ravine, as the insects continued their work, as the forensic evidence accumulated, Norman Thorne decided.
He picked up the telephone. He called the police.
And he told them that Elsie Cameron had taken her own life. What Norman didn't know, what nobody yet understood, was that science had just caught up with him. The insects crawling over Elsie's body were not just signs of death.
They were a timeline.
They were evidence.
And they contradicted everything he was about to say.
At this point, detectives believed they had a complete picture. The forensic evidence seemed conclusive.
The insects told a story. The timeline made sense.
But here's the question you need to answer. Does evidence that seems scientific always tell the truth? And more importantly, when evidence is this complex, when it requires expert interpretation, when it depends on assumptions about temperature and insect behavior in winter conditions, how confident should a jury be in convicting someone of murder? What would you need to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt? When police arrived at the chicken farm on January 19, 1925, they were met with something unusual, a suspect who was confessing. Norman Thorne did not deny that the body was there.
He did not claim ignorance.
He came forward and, while not admitting to direct killing, admitted that Elsie was dead and that she had died on his property. The initial police theory, before the body was even fully examined, was straightforward. Elsie Cameron, in a moment of despair over her romantic situation and uncertain status, had taken her own life. Norman Thorne was a witness and was potentially guilty of not reporting it immediately, but he was not necessarily a murderer.
This theory had certain attractions.
It required no assumptions of hidden malice.
It explained why Thorne came forward.
It fit a pattern that police recognized: a young woman, romantic failure, suicide.
It was simpler than murder.
And it might have been the final determination, except for the forensic examination. Bernard Spilsbury was already a legend by 1925. He was the Home Office pathologist, which meant he was called in on major cases. He was meticulous, scientifically rigorous, and willing to challenge conventional wisdom. He had already made a name for himself in several high-profile cases, and he would go on to become one of the most famous pathologists in British criminal history. When Spilsbury examined Elsie's body, he found those injuries, the signs of asphyxiation, the bruising on the neck, the congestion in the face that suggested violent pressure. These findings immediately made the case more complicated. A suicide victim who hangs themselves or ingests poison might show certain signs. But the signs Spilsbury found, the manual pressure injuries, the specific pattern of bruising, these were more consistent with homicide. But it was the insects that would make this case scientifically revolutionary. Alexander Bohart from the University of California was invited to examine the remains.
This was itself unusual.
In 1925, the use of entomology in criminal investigation was virtually unknown in Britain. Bohart was a leading expert in the field, but calling him in, bringing an American scientist to testify in a British murder trial, was a statement that the police and prosecution took this physical evidence seriously. Bohart conducted a meticulous examination of the insect life found on and around Elsie's body. He identified the species, primarily bluebottle flies, which are very consistent in their breeding and development patterns. He examined the larvae at various stages of development. Here's the critical finding. Based on the developmental stage of the larvae, and accounting for the winter temperatures in England at that time, Bohart concluded that the insects had been at work for approximately 10 days, not 4 days. Wait, let that sink in. If that finding was correct, then Elsie hadn't died on January 15th at all.
She would have died earlier. She would have died around January 8th or 9th. But Norman claimed she had visited him on January 15th. He claimed she had died on that day.
If the insects told a different story, then either 1. Norman was wrong about the date of death, but why would he be, if he'd witnessed it?
2. Norman was lying about when she died.
3. The insects, and the science behind them, were being misinterpreted. Here's where the investigation actually became more sophisticated. Detectives looked at what could be verified. Did anyone see Elsie on January 15th? Yes, witnesses confirmed that she had left her job that day, heading toward the chicken farm. But had anyone seen her after that? Had anyone confirmed that she arrived at the farm on the 15th?
Not really. Norman said she had. No one else had verified it.
What if, and this is speculation, but important speculation, Elsie had actually visited Norman days earlier? What if, unbeknownst to her employer or anyone else, she had already been to the farm? What if the argument, the confrontation, the fatal moment had happened not on January 15th, but days earlier? At this stage, who would you suspect?
Think about it.
A man hiding a body for over a week. A man who only comes forward when he's no longer able to keep the secret. A man whose story is contradicted by insect evidence. What does that suggest to you? The contradictions emerge. But here's where the investigation began to unravel in a different direction. When detectives looked more carefully at the entomological evidence, they found complications. The conditions at the crime scene were not simple. The body wasn't lying in an open field exposed to full sunlight and perfect conditions for insect colonization. It was in a ravine.
It was partially covered.
The temperature fluctuations were different from the outside air.
Some of the insects had been at work for a longer period. Others appeared more recent.
This suggested that the body had moved, or that different areas had been exposed at different times, or that the initial covering had been partial and had shifted. In other words, the insect evidence wasn't the clean, clear timeline that the prosecution wanted to present. Here's something crucial that often gets lost in simplified retellings of this case. Not everyone agreed on the interpretation of the evidence. Some experts, including Spilsbury, leaned toward the interpretation that the body had been hidden initially and then exposed. Others suggested that natural processes, weather, soil movement, animals, could have covered and uncovered the body at different times. There was also genuine scientific uncertainty about insect development rates in winter conditions. Bohart had access to academic literature, but this was still relatively new science. There weren't extensive tables of insect development in English winter weather conditions. There was educated estimation, but estimation, nonetheless. In other words, the forensic science that seemed so revolutionary and certain was, upon careful examination, more ambiguous than it initially appeared. Meanwhile, the cause of death remained contested.
Had Elsie been strangled? The bruising suggested it.
But could the bruising have occurred if she'd hanged herself, perhaps struggling at the end? Could it be consistent with her own hands having scrabbled at her neck in panic? Spilsbury said the injuries were more consistent with external pressure, strangulation by another person. But he couldn't rule out other possibilities with absolute certainty. The case was becoming clearer and murkier at the same time. The physical evidence suggested that Norman was lying, that Elsie hadn't died the way or when he claimed. But it didn't prove what had happened. By the time the case moved toward trial, the police and prosecution had settled on this interpretation. Elsie Cameron had come to the farm seeking commitment from Norman Thorne. Norman had refused. In the course of an argument, Elsie had threatened him with scandal. The threat that she would publicly reveal their intimate relationship, that she would claim he'd abandoned her while pregnant, that she would destroy his reputation. In response, Norman had panicked. In a moment of desperation and rage, he had applied pressure to her neck, intending perhaps to silence her, but causing her death. Then, realizing what he'd done, he had hidden the body in the ravine. He had covered it or left it in a position where the elements could obscure the crime. And he had left it there for days, trying to figure out what to do. Only when he could no longer bear the psychological weight, or perhaps when he realized that someone might discover the body anyway, did he come forward. At this stage, with this narrative in place, the case seemed clear.
Norman Thorne had killed Elsie Cameron.
The only question was whether it was murder or manslaughter, whether it was premeditated or a crime of passion. But as the trial approached, something important happened. Defense counsel for Norman Thorne, his lawyer, began to challenge the entire forensic narrative. Not because he had proof of something different, but because he recognized that the science was more ambiguous than it appeared. His argument was essentially this: you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the insects tell the story the prosecution claims. You can't prove that the body was hidden initially. You can't prove that Norman is lying about the date. And without that proof, you can't prove that the injury patterns definitely indicate strangulation by another person as opposed to some other cause. In other words, the defense was arguing for reasonable doubt, not by proving Norman innocent, but by highlighting the gaps in the prosecution's evidence. This was a sophisticated legal strategy. It didn't say Norman didn't do it. It said, the evidence doesn't conclusively prove that he did. And that distinction would become everything in a trial that hinged on forensic interpretation rather than eyewitness testimony or direct evidence. And now, the entire case would depend on how 12 ordinary people, a jury, would interpret evidence that even the experts disagreed about. To understand what happened in that ravine, we have to understand what Elsie Cameron was experiencing.
She was 21 years old.
She was intelligent, spirited, and, crucially, she was trapped. In 1924 England, a woman in her situation had almost no options. If she was indeed pregnant, or believed she was, the social consequences were dire. Unmarried motherhood was not seen as a lifestyle choice. It was a scandal. She could lose her employment. Her family could be damaged by association. She could be consigned to a life of diminished prospects. And she was dealing with a man, Norman Thorne, who held the key to escaping that situation. He had the power to legitimize her situation through marriage. And he was withholding that power. From Elsie's perspective, she wasn't being unreasonable.
She wasn't melodramatic.
She was in genuine crisis, and she was using the only leverage she had: the threat of revelation, the possibility of public scandal, to try to force a man who had intimate knowledge of her situation to take responsibility. Her visits to the farm, her letters, her emotional appeals. These weren't the actions of a woman being histrionic. They were the actions of a woman in genuine desperation, trying every avenue available to her to change an intolerable situation. Now consider Norman Thorne's position. He was a man in his early 30s, not particularly successful, not particularly ambitious, but trying to build an independent life through the chicken farm. He had entered into an intimate relationship with Elsie. Whether willingly or as a result of seduction, whether he'd promised commitment or not, is unclear.
But he had done so.
And then the situation had escalated beyond his capacity to manage it.
Norman was not a man of action. He was not a man of decisive will.
He was, by all accounts, quiet, introspective, possibly depressed or struggling with his own mental health. When confronted with Elsa's desperation and her threats, his response was evasion, avoidance, withdrawal. These are not the actions of a confident man. They are the actions of a man who felt trapped, who felt out of control, who felt threatened. And here's the crucial psychological insight. A man in that state, a man who feels threatened, who feels out of control, who is being pursued and pressured, can become dangerous. Not because he's inherently violent, but because in a moment of panic and desperation, he can do things he never thought himself capable of. Whether Norman intended to kill Elsie is perhaps the wrong question. The question is whether, in the course of an argument, in a moment of desperation, he applied pressure to her throat or mouth, pressure intended to silence her, to stop her from speaking, to gain control of a situation that felt chaotic, and whether he lost track of how much pressure was too much. By the time he realized what was happening, it was too late. One thing stands out in the historical record. Norman came forward. He called the police. He didn't try to flee. He didn't try to dispose of the body more completely. This is psychologically significant. It could suggest innocence, a man with nothing to hide coming forward to report a tragedy. Or it could suggest guilt that had become psychologically unbearable. A man who couldn't live with what he'd done, who needed to confess, even if his confession was incomplete or dishonest. What the historical record shows is this: Norman's demeanor during questioning was calm, cold, even. He answered questions without apparent distress. He maintained his story consistently. To modern sensibilities, this calmness might read as suspicious. A man who killed his girlfriend should be emotional, should be devastated, should show signs of psychological distress. But here's what we know from psychology: not all guilty people are emotional. Not all traumatized people show it. Some people, under extreme stress, dissociate. They become calm. Their effect, the emotional tone they present to the world, becomes flat, detached, even cold. Norman's calmness doesn't prove him guilty, but it also doesn't prove him innocent. It's a psychological defense mechanism that many people experiencing extreme stress employ. We should also consider what the police and prosecution were under. This was a high-profile case in a small town. There was pressure from the public, from the victim's family, from the newspapers. Murders were not routine. The solution had to be clear. It had to be just. There was an inherent bias toward believing the forensic evidence, particularly the novel entomological evidence, because it seemed scientific and objective. Flies don't lie. The thinking went. Insects follow predictable patterns. But insects are influenced by countless environmental factors. And the interpretation of insect evidence requires assumptions about temperature, exposure, and conditions that are themselves open to challenge. The investigators and prosecutors believed they had a case. They believed the science supported their theory, and they may have been less inclined to closely examine evidence that contradicted their narrative. This is not unique to this case. It's a pattern that appears throughout criminal justice history. Once a narrative forms, evidence that contradicts it is often minimized or reinterpreted to fit the existing theory. The newspapers of the time presented this as a fairly straightforward case. A man had killed his girlfriend, hidden the body, and only confessed when pressed by the weight of forensic evidence. The story was sensational enough: romantic entanglement, desperation, death, but not so complicated that it couldn't be summarized in a headline. The revolutionary nature of the forensic evidence made the case even more newsworthy.
This was science solving a crime. This was progress. This was justice working as it should.
But the more complex reality, that the forensic evidence was ambiguous, that reasonable people disagreed on its interpretation, that the case was not as clear-cut as it appeared, didn't make for good headlines. And here's the crucial reframing that changes how we should see this case. The Norman Thorne case is often presented as a triumph of forensic science. But it's more accurately understood as a case that reveals the limits of forensic science and the dangers of overinterpreting evidence that appears more definitive than it actually is. The insects did provide information. The entomological evidence did suggest that something was inconsistent with Norman's story. But that evidence was interpreted with a degree of confidence that wasn't entirely justified by the science itself.
Was Norman guilty? The evidence suggested he was.
Did he kill Elsie intentionally, or did she die in the course of an argument, in a moment that escalated beyond control? That remained genuinely uncertain. And that uncertainty should matter. In a system of justice that depends on proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, ambiguous forensic evidence, however impressive it seems, should not be sufficient on its own. And all of this came to a head when Norman Thorne walked into the courtroom for his trial. The trial of Norman Thorne took place in Lewes in the spring of 1925.
It was a considerable affair.
The forensic evidence, particularly the entomological testimony, was unprecedented.
Witnesses were called. Arguments were made. Spilsbury testified. Bohart testified.
But the trial also revealed the limits of the science, or rather, the limits of what the science could prove. The defense counsel effectively challenged the interpretation of the entomological evidence. He raised reasonable questions about the developmental rates of insects in winter conditions. He highlighted the ambiguities in the physical evidence. And he presented a coherent alternative, not that Elsie was alive when she supposedly died, but that the evidence didn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Norman had killed her. It was a sophisticated defense strategy, not proving innocence, but raising doubt about guilt. Despite these challenges, the jury found Norman Thorne guilty of murder. Not manslaughter. Murder. This was significant. The jury was saying not just that Norman had killed Elsie, but that he had intended to kill her. That it was not a crime of passion or a moment that escalated beyond his control. That it was murder. Norman Thorne was sentenced to death. The appeal and the commutation. But something remarkable happened. As the case moved through the appeals process, something shifted. New evidence, or more precisely, new interpretations of existing evidence, began to suggest that the conviction might have been unsafe. The entomological evidence, which had seemed so damning, began to look more ambiguous under scrutiny. Questions were raised about the assumptions underlying the insect timeline. Concerns were voiced about whether the evidence truly proved what the prosecution claimed. Additionally, there was a shift in public and expert opinion. Some of the very scientists who had been involved in the case began to express reservations about the strength of the evidence. Ultimately, the conviction was not overturned, but Norman Thorne's sentence was commuted from death to life imprisonment. He was not executed. This commutation was significant. It suggested that, even if guilty of causing Elsie's death, there was reasonable doubt about whether it was premeditated murder, and therefore reasonable doubt about whether death was the appropriate sentence. Norman Thorne served his sentence. He lived out a quiet life in prison. Some accounts suggest he lived into the 1940s or later, but historical records of his later life are sparse. What is clear is that he did not hang, and he did not die young, suggesting that whatever his crime, society's final judgment was that execution was not appropriate. Elsie Cameron's family was left without the closure that execution might have provided. She remained dead. The truth of exactly what happened in those final moments remained ambiguous, despite the revolutionary forensic techniques that had been brought to bear. But the true legacy of the Crowborough case wasn't the conviction or the commutation. It was the establishment of entomological evidence as a legitimate tool in criminal investigation. Over the following decades, the study of insects as forensic evidence developed significantly. Scientists refined techniques for calculating development rates. They created databases of information about how different insects develop under different temperature and humidity conditions. They established protocols for collection and preservation of insect evidence. The Crowborough case, the very case that demonstrated the ambiguity of insect evidence, became the foundation for a forensic discipline that would eventually become much more reliable and useful. But the case also served a darker purpose. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of overinterpreting novel forensic evidence.
It demonstrated that science could seem more certain than it actually is.
It showed how a jury, impressed by expert testimony and revolutionary techniques, can convict on evidence that is ultimately more ambiguous than it appears. Did justice occur? If Norman Thorne intentionally killed Elsie Cameron in a moment of rage or desperation to silence her threat to his reputation, then justice occurred. A murderer was convicted and imprisoned, even if not executed. If, on the other hand, Elsie's death resulted from an accident, from pressure applied in desperation that escalated beyond Norman's intentions, then a man who committed manslaughter was convicted of murder and spent decades in prison for a different crime than the one he committed. The truth, based on the evidence available, falls somewhere in between. Norman Thorne almost certainly applied pressure to Elsie's throat or mouth. Almost certainly, she died as a result of that pressure. Whether he intended her death, or whether he intended only to silence her and lost control, remains uncertain. And that uncertainty is the case's most important legacy. The chicken farm where Elsie Cameron died still stands in Crowborough, though it is much changed. The ravine where her body was found is still there, a depression in the landscape where a young woman's life ended and where forensic science took a significant step forward. The questions raised by this case, about the limits of forensic evidence, about the dangers of certainty when dealing with ambiguous physical evidence, about the vulnerability of young women without resources or protection in a system that saw them as responsible for their own ruin, these questions remain relevant a century later.
We live in an age of forensic science. We have databases of DNA profiles.
We have sophisticated techniques for aging skeletal remains.
We have entomology far more advanced than what Bohart brought to this case. And yet, uncertainty persists. Evidence can be misinterpreted. Science can seem more definitive than it is.
And a system of justice that depends on proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt can sometimes fail, not because the system itself is flawed, but because the evidence it depends on is more ambiguous than it appears to be.
Norman Thorne came forward. He admitted that Elsie Cameron was dead. He admitted that she had died on his property.
But he maintained that he had not killed her, that she had taken her own life. The forensic evidence suggested he was lying. But did it prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? That question, posed in 1925, in a small English courtroom, in a case that would define how we understand forensic evidence, remains, in many ways, unanswered. In the end, the Crowborough Chicken Farm Murder doesn't just ask us who was guilty. It asks us how certain we are, and whether the appearance of scientific certainty is the same as actual certainty. And it asks whether a justice system built on the premise of beyond a reasonable doubt can truly function when the evidence, no matter how revolutionary, leaves room for doubt. The case closed.
Norman lived out his life in prison.
Elsie remained dead. And forensic science took another step forward, carrying with it both its power to illuminate truth and its capacity to oversimplify it. Eulogy for Elsie Cameron. Written in the voice of someone who knew her well. Delivered as if at a memorial, 100 years on. There is something deeply wrong about writing a eulogy for Elsie Cameron.
Not because she doesn't deserve one. She does.
She deserves every word. And more besides. What is wrong is that we are only writing it now, a century after she died. A century after the world moved on. After the newspapers folded her life into headlines. After the courtrooms finished with her name. After the books were written and the forensic textbooks cited her case as a landmark, as a turning point, as a lesson.
A lesson.
As if Elsie Cameron's purpose on this earth was to become a lesson for someone else.
She was not a lesson. She was a person.
Elsie Cameron was born into a world that had very specific ideas about what a young woman was for.
She was for marriage. She was for keeping quiet.
She was for being agreeable, presentable, modest, and above all, careful. Careful of her reputation. Careful of what she said. Careful of what she wanted. Careful never to want too much. Elsie, it seems, was not particularly careful.
Not recklessly so. Not foolishly so.
But she had ambitions that didn't fit neatly into the box her world offered her.
She had opinions. She had energy.
She had the particular kind of restlessness that belongs to intelligent people who can see the edges of the life they've been handed and sense, intuitively, that there is more beyond them.
She took a job as a governess. She worked. She earned her own way.
In 1924, for a young woman of her background, that was not nothing. That was a statement, even if she never thought of it that way. It was a statement that she intended to be something, not just someone's wife, not just someone's daughter, but a person in her own right, with her own labor and her own small independence.
We should remember that.
We should also remember, with honesty and without shame on her behalf, that Elsie loved someone who did not love her back. Or at least, not in the way she needed.
We do not say this to diminish her.
We say it because it is the truest thing about her final months, and because pretending otherwise would be another way of not really seeing her.
She loved Norman Thorne.
Whatever the complications of that relationship, and there were many, she loved him.
She believed in the future they might have together.
She believed, perhaps more than the evidence warranted, that he would come around.
That he would see.
That he would do the right thing.
She kept writing. She kept visiting. She kept trying.
In another time, in a world that offered her more options, more safety, more recourse, perhaps she would have been able to walk away.
Perhaps she could have said, "This is not working. I am leaving. I will build something different." But Elsie did not live in that world.
She lived in 1924 England, where a young woman in her situation, intimate with a man outside of marriage, possibly pregnant, with her reputation fragile as winter ice, had almost nowhere to turn.
She could not simply leave.
The consequences of leaving, of the situation becoming public, were real and devastating and hers alone to bear.
So she stayed. She persisted.
She went back to the farm, one more time, trying to find the resolution that her life depended on.
And she did not come home.
Here is what we lost when we lost Elsie Cameron. We lost whatever she would have become.
We don't know what that was. History didn't give her the chance to show us.
But we can imagine, and imagining is a form of respect, a way of insisting that she was more than a case number, more than a victim, more than a name in a forensic textbook. We can imagine that Elsie Cameron, given time, would have found her way. That her intelligence and her spirit and her stubborn refusal to accept a diminished life would have carried her somewhere. Perhaps she would have married someone who deserved her. Perhaps she would have continued working, building her independence, becoming one of those women of the interwar period who quietly, without grand gestures, made their own lives out of the limited materials available to them. Perhaps she would have had children who would have known her laugh, her opinions, her way of seeing the world. Perhaps she would have grown old and looked back on 1924 as the year she almost broke, and didn't.
We will never know. And that is the true loss.
The court case that followed Elsie's death became famous. Her name is in the history books now, not for what she achieved, not for who she was, but for how she died and what the investigation of her death contributed to forensic science.
There is something unbearable about that.
A young woman's death becomes a milestone.
A landmark.
A first in entomological evidence. And somewhere in the footnotes, in the fine print, in the clinical language of pathology reports, there is Elsie, 21 years old, intelligent, spirited, desperately trying to hold her life together, reduced to a case study.
She deserved better than to be a case study. She deserved to be difficult.
She deserved to be inconvenient. She deserved to be complicated, emotional, and persistent and, yes, sometimes exhausting in the way that people who are fighting for their survival are exhausting.
She deserved to be alive.
If there is anything the world owes Elsie Cameron, it is this: to remember her not as she appeared in the newspapers, not as she appeared in the courtroom, not as the pathologists examined her, but as she was, a young woman trying, in every way available to her, to live.
To live with dignity. To live with some measure of love. To live a life that was hers. She was failed by the man she trusted.
She was failed by a social system that offered her no good options. She was failed, ultimately, by the isolation of a winter morning in Crowborough, when the only person present was the one person who should have protected her.
But she did not fail herself.
She fought for her future right up until the moment she was prevented from having one.
Elsie Cameron was 21 years old. She liked her work. She had opinions. She wrote letters with real feeling in them. She walked through the English countryside in winter to see someone she loved. She was a daughter. She was a young woman. She was a person. And she deserved so much more than what January 1925 gave her. May she rest in the peace that her life denied her.
May we remember her name. Her name, not the case, not the landmark, not the forensic milestone, with the gentleness and the sorrow she is owed.
Elsie Cameron, 21 years old.
Gone too soon, and never forgotten enough. She went looking for a future. She should have found one. Written by Enter the Crime in memory of Elsie Cameron, 1903 to 1925. 100 years on, her name deserves to be spoken with care. Subscribe to Enter the Crime for more global true crime told like a documentary.